Assalamu alaikum and welcome to Beneath the Surface. Today we'll be discussing Gaza and what's currently taking place. Joining us is anti-war activist and political analyst from Stop the War Coalition, JimBraan. Thank you very much for being with us today.
Thank you for having me.
To start off straight away, can you please explain to us what's taking place in Palestine today?
Well, as we speak, there is a kind of low-level continuation of the Israeli assault. And you can say 10 days ago they had to stop the all-out assault that they were waging, but that basically it's carried on. So, for example, they seem to be knocking down tall buildings, and the justification seems simply to be that they are tall buildings that presumably give Gazans the possibility to see from a distance. That's sort of what they're doing right now. In general, I think they clearly decided earlier this year that they had to seize a moment to punish Gaza, and especially to break up any Palestinian unity that was developing. Clearly they had that in mind. They also sat down and they said, well, the Arab rulers are not going to come to the aid, even in words. So that was another calculation. If you look at the last big assault was in 2009. That was something similar. But in that case, they had a window of about 4 weeks in 2009 between the end of the 2008 and Obama's inauguration. And they didn't want to be, at that time, to be seen to be flattening Gaza when Obama came to power. So they were limited by that. This time, they were not limited, as far as they could see. They had by and large, they had the Arab rulers out of the picture. They had the effective agreement of the United States and the West, and they could see no limit. And the fact that they had to stop what they were doing up till 10 days ago and limit it tells you something about the international protest and reaction. But the basic plan must be the same, that they want to break Palestine. Break Hamas from Fatah, for example, break Gaza from the West Bank, seriously damage Hamas, break the people of Gaza from Hamas, and break the people of Gaza. And I would say those would be among their chief aims.
You said that they want to punish Gaza. Why is that? What's their goal, exactly?
Well, 40 years ago, the Israeli Prime Minister said, the Palestinians do not exist. In fact, she famously came to London, and she said it in 2 important places, including BBC Panorama programme. She said, the Palestinians do not exist. And there was a bit of a row at the time that, can you really say that? Nevertheless, she could say it. It wasn't absurd to say it 40 years ago. And 11 years ago, the Israeli Chief of Staff, the head of the Israeli military, said the Palestinians must come to know in their deepest consciousness that they are a defeated people. Now, it's worth noting that if 40 years ago the Palestinians did not exist, then 10 years ago you cannot have a deepest consciousness. But the reason for that is that the Palestinian problem, as the Palestinians say, existence is resistance. And it's not just existence, it's the fact that, for example, when I was a teenager in this country, the word Palestine did not exist. It simply didn't exist. It was an historic term. So if I say to you Abyssinia, you may say to me, well, that's a quaint term, because the term Abyssinia doesn't exist. Well, Palestine didn't exist in the English language. Palestinian didn't exist on its own. You wouldn't talk about somebody being a Palestinian. You spoke about Palestinian refugee and Palestinian hijacker. So Palestine didn't exist, and Palestinian didn't exist on its own. It was that simple. And if you said either of those 2 things, it sounded funny. Well, the Palestinians are much more Palestinian now than they were then. That's clear. We didn't know there was a Palestinian flag, for example. It was about 13 years ago, just after September the 11th, when the United States was ready to invade Afghanistan, and the US and British leaders were going around the region squaring the public opinion, and British Foreign Secretary Jack Straw went to Tehran. And there he said Palestine. And that was something unheard of. British foreign secretaries did not say Palestine. By then you would say Palestinian, yes, but not Palestine. And immediately there was a row here. Foreign secretary said Palestine. What's he implying? And then he came back here and he said, no, he said, sorry, terribly sorry, slip of the tongue. And there was no slip of the tongue. That's typical of a politician. You know, you say one thing to that lot and you say something else over there. But that was the watershed. That was the first time that a British foreign secretary referred to Palestine. So that's one trend. And it's that Israel has to break. So when the military chief said the Palestinians must come to know they are a defeated people, and they don't know that, that's a problem. And one aspect I would suggest of these assaults on Gaza is to try and teach them once again that they are a defeated people.
Israel apparently has admitted that Hamas didn't actually kidnap the 3 teenagers. What's your opinion on this?
Well, I would say, first of all, as soon as the incident came up, I thought it's extremely suspicious, because immediately Israeli government said it's Hamas. And just on simple calculations, you would say, well, first of all, Hamas would never be that stupid to give them a reason, an excuse. Secondly, that's not actually, the West Bank is not actually Hamas's territory. Also because Israel immediately said it was Hamas. Well, how do they know? There's no way of knowing. They didn't have any evidence. They didn't present any evidence. And they immediately went into, for example, I think they arrested 500 Hamas activists. Well, especially that is the way that Israel operates. They use something to implement a completely different agenda. They always do that. They've done it for years. So yes, I don't think, I mean, the fact that they say, no, we don't think Hamas did it, I think anybody with sense would have said that the day it happened. You know?
As you're saying that Israel always uses these type of excuses, when is everyone going to understand that, like, Palestine should be left by its own? Like, Israel shouldn't keep invading or making excuses? Because so many people do protest and say what's taking place is unjust. However, it still continues.
Well, I suppose one thing is, if public opinion was the decisive factor, then things would probably be very different. Public opinion is not the decisive factor. There's power over there, and it's power calculations that decide these things, not public opinion. Nevertheless, public opinion is a factor, and it certainly in this country, for example, it's shifted, and people can just see the simple logic that Israel said, well, we're bombing Gaza because they are firing rockets at us. But the rockets they're firing, in most cases, they're like fireworks. I remember going on at the very beginning, about 1 week after the assault started, going on a London television program. And, this was very early on. And the presenter said, what do you make of it? What do you make of this Israeli self-defense justification? And I remember it had just been announced that 200 Palestinians had died, and at that point there was no published Israeli casualty figure. So I said that as far as we know, not a single Israeli has been scratched. And that puzzled the Zionist who was there. But nevertheless, that was the simple calculation. And people can see that. There's a basic idea that if you injure somebody or you claim that you've been injured, that's not an excuse for you to implement your secret agenda. You know, you could, and people can grasp that.
People can grasp that, and many people have been saying that the Holocaust or history is actually repeating itself. Like just what happened to the Jews many years ago with Hitler. The Holocaust now is actually taking place in Palestine, but of course many people would say it differs slightly from one way to another. But would you agree that it's kind of like the same?
It's got some similarities, but I think in general I wouldn't touch on it too much, because clearly the Holocaust was simply extermination. And it's true that the word genocide, which was defined after the Second World War and was directly based on the Holocaust, talks about the destruction in whole or in part of a people, and then it lists a few others, I think a religious group and so on. If you set out to destroy a people as your conscious aim, that could be by physically killing them, or it could be simply by eliminating them as a people. You know, if you take, well, I mean, it's been done, for example, it was done in colonial countries like Australia, and they took Aborigines and they tried to make them into little white Australians with brown skins to destroy them as a people. And in that sense, yes, in that sense there's clearly an attempted genocide of the Palestinians, evidenced by the Israeli Prime Minister saying at one point the Palestinians do not exist. And in that sense there's a parallel, but clearly the degree of violence is not the same. They're not, you know, yes. So it's probably not, certainly in this country, for example, it's probably not a good idea to raise them, just because it kind of confuses things, because then people say, yes, but they're not setting out to kill all Palestinians. So the issue gets quite messy.
I would understand the sense of they're not going out to kill all Palestinians, but when looking at the history and looking at the map of Palestine and how much, you know, Jewish settlers went into Palestine and they were able to kind of like coexist, and slowly Palestine was completely off the map, and then they had as little land as they have today. And isn't that kind of like the same thing though, of they're actually like being defeated, they're actually being washed away?
Yes, but I mean, it's just that if you talk about if you talk about Holocaust, you specifically, Holocaust was a particular genocide. It clearly was a genocide, and it was done in a specific way. But then people associate that. If you start equating the Holocaust of the Second World War with the attempted genocide of the Palestinians, then I think it causes more confusion. Certainly in this country, because people say, well, you know, it doesn't compare, and in one way it doesn't compare. But if you talk about simply and legally about the genocide of the Palestinians, no, they're not setting out to kill them, but they were certainly setting out to destroy them as a people. So, for example, Palestinian Arabs, Palestinians who live in Israel, are simply referred to as Israeli Arabs. But clearly they're just that part of the Palestinian population that found themselves inside Israel. But they're not treated as being part of the Palestinian population. They're treated as a separate category. And no, clearly there's loads of evidence that they wished to eliminate the Palestinians as a people. And in fact, there was a phrase, I believe some top Zionists use it. They said the old will forget. No, that's right, the old will die and the young will forget. And that was the plan, forget being Palestinians. And as some young man said on one of these demonstrations in London a couple of weeks ago, the old may have died, but I'm young and I haven't forgotten. And that's their problem. The Palestinians are more Palestinian, they're not less Palestinian.
Dozens of Holocaust survivors have written to the Israeli government stating that what's taking place, as you also described, is genocide. And they're asking everything to stop. Do you think that the Israeli government is actually going to listen to its people?
Well, if you're specifically talking, if you're asking, is the Israeli government going to listen to those, I think it was
The
something
Holocaust
like 200,
survivors,
yes.
yeah.
There was that particular advertisement that was published in United States and in Britain.
Mm-hmm.
No, the answer is no, in the sense that they will undoubtedly, if they have replied, which they probably haven't replied, but if they have replied, I have no doubt that they have replied in a way that absolutely rubbishes the statement. But that doesn't mean that it won't have an effect, because there was going back to 2009, there was an assault which was not as bad as this one, but not far off. And a year later, there's a institution in Israel called the Reut Institute, and it's a kind of semi-official, it's not a government agency, but it's very close to power in Israel. And a year later, that was 2010, they published a report summarizing what they took to be the lessons of 2009. And they said, we won the war on the ground in 2009, but we lost the war for public opinion. And I would just point out that if they say they won the war on the ground, I mean, it was a lot more like a massacre than a war. So, but having said that, the fact that they said there were two aspects, the war itself and the war for public opinion, the fact that they thought those two things were equal, you can see why, in the sense that there is most issues of occupation, by and large, they are an issue between the occupied and the occupier in general. And historically, you can point to examples, I mean, colonial struggles, for example, in general. But in the case of Israel-Palestine, you have one state simply on top of another. So it's almost literally like one people living underneath another. And therefore, international public opinion potentially makes an enormous difference, far more difference than in typical occupation struggles. So for them to say, we lost the war for public opinion, they went on to say that the war for public opinion is not fought in Palestine, it's fought abroad. And then they said, especially in London, New York, and Montreal. And I think you can certainly say that if that was true in 2009, then it is many times more true in 2014. And that's where if they say the war is fought in London and New York, firstly, and you have a London paper and a New York paper publishing a letter from Holocaust survivors condemning the Israeli government actions, that is bound to have an enormous effect. Although I don't think that you can point to anything coming up in the near future that you can say, oh, look, that caused the Israeli government to stop doing this or start doing that. I don't think so. But undoubtedly, probably they will do another report in a year's time, like the one I've referred to, and probably they won't publish it because it must, by rights, say the same thing, only much louder.
Yeah, because I was going to say, like, if it was about public opinion, many more people in 2014 have gone to the streets in London, like over 1,500 it was, have gone, and everyone is protesting from all different religions, and even atheists started going to the street, and from many different ethnicities, and everyone is calling, you know, for Israel to stop attacking Gaza. Isn't that going to like change anything in any way? What more can the people do?
Unfortunately, there's not a lot more, although people can work consistently between, you know, what happens at the moment, of course, is that tens of thousands of people turn out when there is an assault on. But remember that Gaza has been under siege for, was it 7 years? So the siege is a continuous thing. And to actually get people to take up that question, I mean, just lift the siege, and to take that question up is a matter of consistently working at it rather than turning out once a year or once every 2 years. So that's quite difficult to do, you know, because obviously people have other things. The siege, you don't see the siege, they don't show the siege. So that's one aspect, that you take that public opinion and you make that public opinion actually act consistently. And there is this boycott, divestment and sanctions movement. And I think it has a kind of limited place, but it does have a place. It means especially boycott Israeli goods. Well, there's not that many Israeli goods. I mean, I haven't looked in my supermarket, but I guess there would be, for example, Israeli oranges, fruit, for example, very likely. So there is that movement, and that you know, that has some effect, and people have gone in, stood outside supermarkets and explained to people, don't buy Israeli goods and so on, which is one way of keeping that consistent pressure up. But in general, I think you're right. There isn't an easy way of translating public opinion into affecting power, because, I mean, for example, we could, local to me, we could organise it that we go and see our MP. And being a politician, first of all, there's no direct way that he's going to, he's in opposition, he's in the opposition Labour Party, so there's no obvious way that he's going to make a difference. But even if he expressed some words saying, yes, he was sympathetic to the Palestinians and so on, that's what he says now. Perhaps when he gets into power it could be different. You never know, you know. But I saw, the one thing I saw just down the road from where I live about 3 weeks ago, the mums, there's a thing called the Mums Network, and I think it mainly exists online. It's in South London, and there's 1,300 on that particular Mums Network, and they organised a protest, and that was really something to see. And I don't think I've ever seen anything like that, because obviously you need a certain consciousness. And the woman I dealt with directly, she obviously, well, she had it, but I don't know how political it is. But basically they said, well, stop killing the children, you know, which is a very simple slogan. But they did it very well. They picked the main road out of London to the south, but where it narrows, and there's a wall, and there's a piece of green, and they assembled there, and they protested, and they had banners, people made individual drawings, and they brought children along and so on. So I think that's in a sense how deep it got. I've never seen that before, you know, because these are not, there's nothing political about it. It's Mums Network. I suppose they make sure that there's childcare and schooling and, you know, that kind of thing. So for them to take that up is quite striking.
That is really good, but many times, like speaking about politicians, about the situation in Palestine and Israel, everyone keeps saying that they should do the two-state solution and everything else, but how many times would they have to bring up that, you know, solution if it doesn't actually work? Or do you think it would actually work?
I think that this phrase two-state solution is a very difficult one, because sometimes people talk about a two-state solution, and sometimes they talk about the two-state solution. And I think the short answer is, first of all, Israel has to recognize the national rights of the Palestinian people. It's not something they're granting, they're not giving anything, it doesn't belong to them. And then you face this simple problem that there is an Israeli nation. There never was an Israeli nation, but clearly a nation has been created and so on. So that's a fact. But the fact also is there is a Palestinian nation. That's a fact. And if you start from that presumption, or you start from that position, then you have the possibility of working out, and it'd probably take you many years to work out on that basis a solution. At the moment, Israel doesn't recognise that, so that's an essential step. If Israel was to ever recognise that, you'd probably have to have a rolling solution, in a way perhaps a little bit like Northern Ireland, where everybody agrees that the solution that they've put in place in Northern Ireland in the last 15 years or so is in some way temporary, but that each side has made some concession and that's produced a kind of peace for now kind of thing. And long term, again, you can, if you accept that principle, you can then work everything else out. If Israel accepts the full national rights of the Palestinian people as a starting point, then you can negotiate from there. But at the moment, it's just that Israel sometimes pretends that maybe it will acknowledge some kind of Palestinian authority or state, but they never do it on the basis of the national rights of the Palestinian people. They simply do it on the basis of saying what they think they have to say, or pleasing the American president by saying something, whereas clearly in practice they keep on building on even that land that they claim is possibly to be Palestinian controlled. They carry on building on it.
Speaking of the Israeli government, how did it actually come into power? Like before, it was just meant to, when we look back at the Balfour Agreement, it was mainly just for the Jewish people to settle in a land where apparently, or they were meant to be all peaceful and everything, but then it became its own state. How did that actually happen?
Well, the father of modern Zionism, which is a political thing, it's not a religious thing. The father of modern Zionism, at the end of the 19th century, he led the Zionist movement, and it was a modern thing. And he said, Jews cannot live. Essentially, Jews cannot live in Europe. Most Jews thought that they could live in Europe, but the Zionist movement said, no, you can't. We are different. We have to have our own state. And he wrote a book called The Jewish State. And he said that that state would be a bastion of Europe against Asia. That's how he described it, because remember at that time it was classic imperialism. Each of the European powers had their own colonial empires or spheres of influence. And he went to the different heads of Europe, to the Tsar of Russia and the Emperor of Germany, and he said, I have this project, the Zionist project, for a Jewish homeland. If you back us, we will look after your interests. And it wasn't originally necessarily in Palestine. There were a number of places, like Madagascar, which was occupied by France, and Patagonia, which was part of Argentina, and so on, or even East Africa, which was run by Britain. But each of these was considered, but mainly they wanted Palestine, clearly. And Britain was eyeing up the Ottoman Empire, and they were looking towards the day when they broke it up. And it was clear that Britain had its eye on Palestine. So really Britain was the #1 power to go to. And then you fast forward to 1917, and British government issues this declaration. It's interesting, it's important to note the wording of it, because the Balfour Declaration said that the British government favours the creation of a national homeland for the Jewish people, provided the rights of the existing population are respected. So when British government presents itself as being some power with interest in the matter, it's worth remembering that it's 100 years ago that Britain undertook to look after the rights of the existing people. So you can judge the British government's stand against what's happening on the ground. In what way does British government think that the rights of the existing population are being looked after? But then you had this period of, after the Balfour Declaration and after the First World War, you had this period of Jewish immigration into Palestine. You had Jewish settlements that were, as a proportion of the land area, were quite small. you fast forward, you had the Arab Revolt of 1936-39 that was put down with great brutality by Britain. You had a kind of truce during the Second World War. But you had the Zionist project, whatever, that was written down.
But the Zionist project does go against the Jewish religion itself. Yes, because from their book, the Torah, the Holy Book, they state that the Jewish people are not really meant to have a state. They're not meant to have a land. So how come the Zionist ideology continued and it's still actually
Well, that's why I say modern Zionism is a political thing, not a religious thing, because the idea of creating a nation out of a religion, that's a peculiarity of modern Zionism. And you don't even have to be very religious or hardly religious at all. But if you are declared to be a Jew within their conception, then you fall within the Zionist project and you can, for example, emigrate to Israel. And in some ways it's an absurdity because the Romans, they had a problem with the Jews because there is this, I don't know if you've ever come across Jehovah's Witnesses. Have you ever come across them? Yeah, I mean, they come to my house twice a year or something, and I have a little chat with them and so on. But they're very evangelical. They're the only evangelicals left, the people who come to your door. The Jews were like that 2,000 years ago. It was just a religion, and they wanted to spread their religion. And they did, and there was a Berber Jewish kingdom in Tunisia. There was a Kurdish Jewish kingdom, and then there were the people that they've been lost to history, but the Khazars, and they were all Jewish kingdoms, but they didn't come from Palestine to there. The religion spread, not the people. So in that sense, Jews don't come from Palestine. It's not like they all started in Palestine at some point and spread out. So in the same way that Catholics, for example, Roman Catholic Christians, they don't come from Rome. Their spiritual home is Rome. But people become Catholic all over the world. Well, at one time you could become Jewish anywhere in the world. And there's examples like the Falashas of Ethiopia. Well, they look nothing like somebody who comes from Central Asia. You look at a Falasha, they look just like other Ethiopians, because they are, and at some point they converted to Judaism and they call themselves Beit Israel, so that gives you an idea, and the other Ethiopians call them Falashas. Well, clearly they are people who just adopted the Jewish religion, but they didn't become part of a nation. But that's what political Zionism did. It took people who had some connection with the Jewish religion and said, you're now part of a nation.
There was a protest in front of the BBC as many people were actually very angry at the BBC because they weren't actually covering the situation in Palestine equally. They weren't actually stating what's going on. What's your opinion on that?
Oh, I think probably the most striking thing and probably shocking thing that I've seen of its kind in the last 6 weeks was we had 3 national demonstrations, 3 demonstrations in London that were wider than just London over the month or the 5 weeks of the first part of the assault. And each one was bigger than the last. But even, for example, the first demonstration that we had, I was very busy on the day of the demonstration, so on the Sunday, the following day, I start looking for how the media had reported it. Channel 4, for example, television, reported from Palestine and said that the Palestinians received the pictures from London with joyous disbelief. That's how they put it. So that was, that was a good report. The Daily Mail, which is, supports the ruling Conservative Party, its report had a headline, "In our thousands," quote, "in our thousands, in our millions, we are all Palestinians." And it went on to simply report the demonstration. There was a big picture that took up the width of the road, very powerful, that went all around the world. They included that, and they simply went round reporting facts and asking people. That's the Daily Mail. The BBC had a single article titled "Riots in Paris." And it was all about the fact that the French government had banned people from demonstrating over the question of Gaza in Paris, and then there had been opposition to that. And at the end of that report, they reported, and there was a demonstration in London. And you thought, BBC is in London, that's its first responsibility. But the first demonstration was bad, they're reporting. The second demonstration was terrible. And then there was a gap of 1 week. And then we had the last of the large ones. And suddenly, we were watching it with the people who were responsible, we were watching it afterwards, and it suddenly came up on the telly, and they showed everything. They just showed it in a way that if you want to show the size of something, you have to do a long shot, and if you want to get an individual's perception, you do a close-up. You know, all these sorts of things, and they gave it 3-4 minutes, and it was very good. But the fact that they could suddenly decide we're going to give it publicity, that's the striking thing. And I think that was because that was the end of the all-out assault. The British government had decided that they'd had a month and that the public opinion would now really start to take off. And I think the British government simply told the BBC, cover that properly. Otherwise, you have to have some explanation.
But also, like the BBC, one of their best correspondents, Jeremy Bowen, he was actually removed from Gaza when he stated that Hamas isn't actually using children as shields. Like, the Israeli government was very angry about that. Isn't that also like very bad that he actually was stating the truth, was stating what he witnessed himself, but then he was removed for saying something like that?
Yes, and you would think the British government would protest, wouldn't you?
You would imagine they would.
At his removal, yeah. And no, there's no doubt at all. I mean, what the Israelis say, it's like they're telling you, don't look at the evidence of your own eyes, listen to what we say. And it's clearly not the same thing. It's clearly, it was very clear that they wanted to kill the maximum number of Palestinians, or the maximum number of Gazans. You know, to kill 2,000 people in a month, that's a lot of killing. So it's clearly that was part of their strategy. And yet Israeli spokespeople were allowed to come on and just repeat endlessly how carefully, they would always talk about how we're very, very careful, you know, to distinguish between fighters and civilians, whereas all the evidence says that's exactly the opposite is true. And the way that they question Israeli spokespeople, because Israeli spokespeople are very well trained, they just repeat the same thing, but they repeat it very clearly. And the way a reporter interviews an Israeli spokesperson, they just let it go. They accept it. They don't seriously question it.
Because there was an interview on Fox News also where this kind of situation happened. They had, as you said, an Israeli spokesperson. As you also said, he kept repeating himself. But they also had an opposition. And because he was stating what's actually taking place, like many civilians are being killed, the presenter kept asking him, do you think that Hamas is a terrorist organization? And because he wasn't actually answering that question, he just kept shouting at him, and nobody actually knew exactly what was going on. Like, if we were to watch it in America, we wouldn't actually know. But the question here is, what can people do to actually find out the truth? For example, in America, many reporters are actually stating everything's okay, and Israel's kind of like defending itself, whereas that isn't the actual situation.
Well, I think one thing is, I think the media, even compared to, say, 4 years ago, the media is less powerful because social or other forms of media are that much more available. People made the point that what people saw from inside Gaza 4 years ago, and now they're seeing much more, because even in that space of 4 years, it's much easier to just take a picture, upload it, send it, you know. So in a sense, I think the media blockade just isn't that effective, isn't as effective as it used to be. Also, you get this thing that if you're prepared to put one foot in front of another, you know, and most people in this country don't have the experience of walking in the street. When you're a child, you're told, no, don't walk in the street, be careful, etc. And the first time in your life that you actually walk in the street, you feel, wow, you know, this is really something. But by doing that, you're breaking a convention. And to the extent that you can harness that, and it's up in the air at the moment, but if you've got 100,000 people or something who actually took to the streets, there are certainly things you can do. I mean, you can certainly boycott Israeli goods, although, as I say, that there are, you know, there's very limited numbers of them. But the publicity is quite powerful. And even if you go to your local supermarket and you say boycott Israeli goods, and you explain to people, that does them enormous damage, and it creates public opinion, and you can use that as a hook. So there are things, we'll have to see, but I suspect you'll find, if you take, like in this country, if you take 1 year from now, and you look at what's actually being done on a local level, then I suspect you'll find relatively a large upsurge. People will be...
But one of the things that people fear is being called anti-Semitic, because if they're to speak negatively of the Israeli government, it would kind of also indicate or say that they're also talking about the Jewish, which would then straight away label them as anti-Semitic. So wouldn't that kind of like stop people from speaking out loud and publishing things that are taking place?
I'm not sure, it's hard to say, but I think that this appearance that the Israeli spokespeople just rattle off things, a script, when you have that and you have the reality, to the extent that you see the reality, there comes a point where it doesn't work anymore. And one of the things they always rattle off is this thing about anti-Semitism, because they just say Israel equals the Jews, and whether you agree, if you're Jewish, whether you agree with Israel or not, it doesn't matter. Israel still equals the Jews. Therefore, criticizing Israel is criticizing the Jews, and I think it simply doesn't work in that way anymore. A generation ago, it worked much better. But now, because people can see the way Israeli propaganda works, and when it's so detached, so what you're seeing over there, which is hundreds of dead children, and you're seeing this voice over here coming through the television telling you that we're very, very careful to avoid harming innocents, then you begin to doubt the whole script, including this accusation of anti-Semitism.
You may begin to doubt it, but being like in London, maybe because we have a lot of oppositions and we have anti-war groups, we kind of do understand what's going on. Like on social media, many groups would state what's taking place in Gaza, and if we didn't have that, we'll just be mainly relying on BBC, for example, on ITV and Channel 4. They're the main channels we have, which would be focusing on the news. But if we just rely on them, then they wouldn't actually be telling us what's going on. Like, because the West is supporting Israel, they wouldn't actually give us the clear picture. What more can we do to understand what's actually taking place?
Well, I just wonder how much people get, and I'm not talking about political activists necessarily, but the wider sphere than that. I'm wondering how much they get from the classic television channels. and how much they got from other sources. Because it's so easy now. I mean, you look at the number of people who are on internet, and it's basically everybody who's on social media, just about everybody who wants to be. So, you know, who do you trust? I'm not talking about a particularly politically conscious person, but if, you know, people have circles on social media, and if they trust one particular person and they send them stuff, then it's a case of trusting your friend or trusting that man on the television. You probably trust your friend, you know, so your friend on social media becomes your reporter. And I think that's an enormous difference.
Asking you the last question, when do you think Israel will actually stop torturing Palestinians?
I think, unfortunately, at the moment, I think they've miscalculated. On the other hand, they saw a window. As far as they were concerned, US backs them, Europeans back them. The Arab rulers are, you know, don't want to know in the way that they did before. So they saw a wide open goal as far as they were concerned, and they just went for it, and they went for it even more powerfully. They had no limits like they had in 2009. And yet they had to stop the all-out assault after a month, because this factor of public opinion, which they mentioned after the earlier assault, was that important. And now I think they're presenting this line of "we don't care." You know, there's a football club in London called Millwall, and they have a bad reputation. And they used to go around shouting, "Nobody likes us, but we don't care." And that was a bit of a joke of theirs. Well, in a way, Israeli government is putting on this front of "nobody likes us, but we don't care." But we know that they do, so there's a kind of element of bluff going on. They're pretending we're not going to take any notice, but certainly they're taking notice. But when it will end, or see, they have to recognize that until they recognize the national rights of the Palestinian people, there's a basic problem. That seems to me the watershed. And no, I can't see the point when that would happen. On the other hand, the region, you know, the region makes a difference. It might be that regimes actually do take a stand, which I mean, that's a thing that's been going on for a few years now, that they are, I mean, the Arab League, for example, that presents itself as being pro-Palestinian and has as its founding principle the defense of the sovereignty of Arab states, is busy violating the sovereignty of whichever states that its backers don't like. So that's not going to change that quick, but
We'll just all have to be hopeful, I guess.
I mean, I think you have to, I always put it this way, that this slogan, "existence is resistance," that the Palestinians have, is really a serious thing, because it's the existence of the Palestinians that Israel is tearing its hair out over. If they could find a way of getting rid of them, they would. But the reality is that the Palestinians exist much more now as Palestinians than they did a generation ago. And that's absolutely key. Lots of people in history have disappeared. You know, you can read old texts and you can find ancient peoples referred to, and you don't even know what language they spoke. You just lots of them have disappeared, and one that has not disappeared, that should have disappeared according to Zionist thinking, is the Palestinians.
Thank you very much for being with us on the show, and thank you very much for joining us. See you next time on Beneath the Surface.